Do you understand? This bamboo becomes a sword.
The first time I installed Linux was back in 1999. I managed to successfully install Red Hat. I assure you back then, installing Linux was not the easiest thing to do. Since then, I tried many distributions, but I always retained Windows as my main operating system. Last summer, the summer of 2022, I moved to a house by the beach only for the summer period. I took with me a laptop and I said to myself, let's induce some new problems into our life by having only a Linux distribution. So the laptop boots only to Linux. It doesn't have another operating system. To be honest, I thought that I will switch back to Windows after a few days. Although it was a bit of frustrating, I kept using it for the whole summer. The summer has now ended and I'm going back to my home where I will install a Linux distribution on my main computer as my default operating system. Here are all the points that I noted during the summer of where Linux is better than Windows. You don't have to look for or install drivers. All drivers come by default in all Linux distributions. When you are using Windows for a long time, they keep getting slower and slower. That is because the operating system tends to reserve more and more resources. And then you reach a point where you have to format your hard drive and install a fresh copy of Windows. Some schmucks might say that you don't need to format your Windows machine. You can just download a registry cleaner and bullshit like that. A Windows system in time becomes heavy either or elsewhere. At some point, you have to format it. Linux, on the other hand, does not require a format. When Linux becomes heavy, you delete a few folders and it becomes brand as new, with all its resources once again available. Installing applications on Linux is easy as it is enjoyable. You don't have to search on the web, you just open a command prompt and type sudo apt-get install and the program's name, and the program gets immediately installed. If you don't like that way, which I assure you it is the best way that can possibly exist, you can open up a package manager like Synaptic and download the application of your choice along with all the libraries and extra software needed for the application to run. And don't think for a moment, oh, on Windows we don't need extra software in order to install a program. Of course you do. You need Net Framework and a million other bullshit that need to be installed for some applications to run. And the same applies when removing software. You don't have to click on the idiotic section called Programs and Features in order to uninstall an application. You can just do it from the terminal. When you search for a file on Windows, for example called mspaint.exe, and you type the first letter of the file's name, M in our case, the File Explorer of Windows takes you to the first file that has an M as its first character. But then, when you press the second character, in our case the S, instead of continuing the string, Windows File Explorer shows up files starting from S. On the contrary, when typing characters, Linux just completes the search string. To do the same thing on Windows, you have to drag your mouse cursor over here in the input box and then type the file's name. Extra clicks and extra work for the brainless. Those that have no brain have strong hands. When you open a text file on Winblows and you press Ctrl F and you type in the search string, it needs directions of where it should search, downwards or upwards. Like there was a chance that you are searching for something that is located up, since you just opened the file and the cursor is located on the top. On Linux, when you open a text file, it of course doesn't stupidly ask you whether your search string is upwards or downwards. On Winblows, you have to click on the bottom right corner of your screen for all windows to be minimized. On Linux, you don't have to click. Once you drag your cursor at the bottom right corner, all windows automatically minimize. You might think, what is a click next to eternity? Well, when you use a computer 10 to 12 hours a day, believe me, it makes a difference. I have 3 years now that I switched mouse from right hand to left hand because of tendonitis, an illness of the muscles that occur because of extreme finger usage. When you want to copy a file in a folder where a file of the same name exists, Windows asks you whether you want to overwrite, cancel, but there is no option to rename the files as pleased. On Linux you have the possibility to keep both files but also rename the moving file. Windows prompt is complete bullshit and always will be, because Windows are fundamentally different than Linux. Winblows were meant for friendly user experience and thus they never provide inside information about what is going on underneath in the kernel of the operating system. You never see true info. The command prompt of Linux, also known as terminal, is greatly important and greatly significant. It provides insights and valuable information about what is really going on behind the scenes. For example, if a program is not running and you want to know what the fault is, you execute it through terminal and terminal outputs valuable information about what went wrong and your program didn't start. Windows is a closed system. It does not reveal information to the user because by providing information you hand over authority. Information is power. The recycle bin of Winblows is as stupid as fuck. When you try to open files, you will get a denial. On Linux, on the other hand, you can open any file from within the trash bin, as should be rationally expected. Linux runs Windows programs better than Windows. On Linux, you can choose which Windows version you are going to use for a specific program. And at that point, you will jump off your chair saying, I can do that on Windows too. I can choose which version of Windows is compatible with the software that I'm trying to run. Yes. And what about the applications that need to be installed alongside? What if this application that you are trying to run needs Net Framework 3 and another application you are trying to run requires Net Framework 4.5? What will you do then? I will tell you what. You will cry out because of your stupid operating system. On Linux you can have multiple versions of Windows running simultaneously, each one with different core applications installed and even a different registry. Exactly. On Linux you can have as many virtual Windows machines as you like, each one with different registry and different settings. The way Microsoft Windows treat FTP is both pathetic and embarrassing. Let's see what happens when we try to run a file on FTP. The file simply won't open. Let's see what happens when we try to run a file on FTP on a Linux machine. The file runs as it should. Linux treats FTP folders as any other local folder. You can read, write or execute any file on any FTP folder. On Windows machines, when you overwrite a file on an FTP folder, Windows do not refresh the folder and keep showing you non-existing files. Once you refresh, you will only see the files that do really exist. Such bugs do not have place on an advanced operating system such as Linux. When you open an FTP folder on Linux, Linux mounts the given route, and you can close the window and the FTP access will remain mounted till you shut down the system. One of the most annoying things, at least for me, on Windows 10 is the following. You cannot switch off antivirus or Windows Defender. Yes, I know that theoretically there are ways to turn it off, but once you install a new version of Windows, everything automatically gets re-enabled. There is no way to keep the antivirus or the firewall disabled for a long time. It keeps re-enabling itself. Linux does not have an antivirus or a defender, which are all useless after all. There are simply no viruses for Linux. There are no Trojans for Linux, and there hardly is malicious software intended for Linux. That does not happen only because Linux is used by the elite or else 1% of the population, and so the criminals won't bother wasting their time on a product with such small popularity. It happens also simply because Linux is invulnerable. There is a huge society of programmers associated with Linux, and thus it is much more likely that the bug will be firstly discovered by the society rather than hackers. Linux offers amazing compatibility among file types. For example, Linux did not only figure that .exe files should open with a Windows emulator such as Wine, but it also understands that some of them are executables not for Microsoft Windows but for Microsoft DOS, and thus it automatically opens DOSBox emulator and runs the game flawlessly. No restarts are required on Linux. Linux will never ask you to restart your computer. Windows, on the other hand, constantly break your balls by asking to restart your computer for changes to take effect. And even if Windows doesn't ask you to restart your computer, you have to figure it out consciously by watching your resources drain and your system becoming slow as hell. Stompin is a musical program that runs on Windows 98. Windows Compatibility Troubleshooter fails to identify its requirements, stating that it should run on Windows 8, which is of course false. By setting the correct versions of Windows manually, The program also fails to open. How lame behalf Windows. Windows have no backwards compatibility with its previous versions. What a massive fail. The vast majority of the globe's population use an operating system that was entirely encoded by blondes. The program of course runs on Linux as Linux is unstoppable. What a triumph over Windows. A handful of independent programmers have created something much more advanced and much more sophisticated than what the world's best software company has created. And the most important reason of all that I am switching permanently from Microsoft Windows to Linux is because Linux is free and open source. And that means that there is a huge community of developers that are working on it selflessly, with the only intention to make it better and not with the sole intention of making money. Making money is a good thing, but not when it comes to basic things like free speech, free education, free information, and free communication among humans.